You ever sit down and think about codenames in the X-Men corner of the universe? Sure, there's relatively benign sounding ones like Pixie, Elixir, and Jubilee, and even kinda funny ones like Dupe, Beak, and Eyeboy. But for every few X-Men characters out there with a cool or funny codename, there's some with names that immediately signals someone worth running away from. One such character isn't even a mutant, but is part of their history in Marvel, the Juggernaut. Debuting in issue 12 of the original Stan Lee and Jack Kirby run of the X-Men, Juggernaut is the stepbrother of Charles Xavier and one of the X-Men's oldest and strongest foes. Juggernaut was born Cain Marko, and after his mother died, his father, a renowned scientist, married the widow of his colleague and took in her son as well, a young Charles Xavier. Dr. Marko showed immense favoritism of Xavier over Cain, who'd take it out on Charles by physically abusing him. In a confrontation with his father, Cain, intending to solely just make a mess, instead accidentally causes a chemical reaction that resulted in an explosion. Charles and Cain survive, but Dr. Marko succumbed to smoke inhalation, telling Charles to make sure to hide his now manifesting mutant abilities, which Cain overheard. After a large fight between both Cain and Charles that the latter won, the two would find themselves years later stationed in Korea as a part of the same military unit. Cain goes AWOL and Charles tracks him down to a cave housing a mysterious red gem. Cain grabs it and the idol it was placed on relays a message to him. Whosoever touches this gem shall possess the power of the Crimson Bands of Sidorak. Henceforth, you who read these words shall become forevermore a human Juggernaut. This transforms Cain into the unstoppable Juggernaut, amplifying his strength and increasing his size to absurd proportions. A cave-in happens right after that Xavier escapes from, but Juggernaut took a bit longer to dig himself out of it, now no longer needing food or any other sustenance. This power comes from Sidorak, an immensely powerful extra-dimensional being that was banished from our dimension eons ago. To enact his will of destruction, he instead started choosing avatars to serve him, these avatars getting the strength of a Juggernaut. His name rings bells in the mystic side of Marvel particularly. The Crimson Bands of Sidorak have been invoked as a spell often used by Doctor Strange. Juggernaut would start a career as a mercenary, usually teaming up with Black Tom Cassidy, the cousin of longtime X-Men member Banshee. He'd cross paths with many characters like the Hulk, Doctor Strange, Thor, and even Captain Britain. Juggernaut, despite his immense strength, spends a good amount of his time as a villain losing to other people. A lot. A particularly notable example is in the lead up to Onslaught, where Juggernaut, being one of the few people that knows Onslaught's identity at that point in time, confronts him and gets knocked from Canada clean into New Jersey, signifying that whoever Onslaught is, he's immensely more powerful than anyone's prepared for. That said, in recent times, Juggernaut's actually reformed and as of this video's release, is actually an official member of the X-Men, using a suit fashioned from the Crimson Bands of Sidorak that restored his once lost powers. He became a recognizable enough part of the X-Men Rogues Gallery that pretty much every adaptation of the franchise features him somehow. X-Men the Animated Series is a prominent example, which indirectly led to a legendary parody video in the late 2000s, which actually ended up being referenced in an actual X-Men movie proper. Funny how things go sometimes.
Yeah, it's the Juggernaut, bitch! Yeah, Charles, I'll beat the shit out you.
Don't you know who I am? I'm the Juggernaut, bitch!
He was also a frequent boss character in X-Men video games, one such game being X-Men on the Sega Genesis, where he's the first boss you face. Of course, that meant he'd eventually find his way to Capcom's Marvel Fighters as a mid-boss in 1994's X-Men Children of the Atom. According to former Capcom artist Katsuya Akitomo, who was actually in charge of Juggernaut's sprite work in that game, he initially modeled Juggernaut's design after his appearance in issue 2 of Thunderstrike. Veteran Capcom artist Akiman apparently saw the design and advised Akitomo to make his proportions even more exaggerated, resulting in the sprite we have now. Juggernaut's voiced in Children of the Atom by George Buza, who voiced Beast in X-Men the Animated Series. He also voices Omega Red, Magneto, and Colossus in Children of the Atom as well. You might be wondering why a few characters in Children of the Atom have their animated series voice actors and some don't, and there's actually a good reason for that. According to Polygon's oral history of Children of the Atom, which will be linked in the description, the development team wasn't actually expecting to be able to land the original voice actors, and instead hired English-speaking voice actors in Japan for the cast. 2 weeks before the game was set to go out, Marvel had actually rejected all of the cast recordings, with the exception of Silver Samurai. People on the English side of Capcom were able to get in touch with Marvel, who referred them to the Canadian studio the cartoon's voice actors worked through and set everything up. Considering this was all seemingly on short notice, I can imagine they had to work with who was available, which is likely why George Buza and Catherine Disher in particular voiced 3 or 4 characters apiece in this game. All that said, let's get started with Children of the Atom. In his first appearance in Capcom's Fighters, Juggernaut actually wasn't traditionally playable. He was the penultimate fight in Children of the Atom, being the main obstacle standing between you and the final boss fight against Magneto. And what an intimidating obstacle he is. Juggernaut is easily one of the biggest characters in the game, only eclipsed by Sentinel, at least in terms of height. Even scarier is the amount of damage he can dish out with just a stray hit. Depending on the character and interaction, a stray heavy punch can do anything from 1/4 to 1/3 of your life bar in damage. His availability and home ports of the game have been interesting to say the least. He's not playable in most Sega Saturn releases of the game. I say most because there is one exception, the Japanese Saturn release. The Japanese Saturn version has a trick that can be done in Versus mode. To do it, you first had to enter the code that unlocks Akuma. After winning or losing a fight in Versus mode with him, return to the character select screen and carefully press up and left twice. The first time you do it, you should see the character portrait turn to Wolverine, and the second time, it should become Juggernaut. This was definitely an unintended glitch, however, and Capcom actually acknowledged it in the lead up to the Saturn port's US launch, saying the bug would be fixed for international release, and sure enough, it was. The PS1 port a few years later actually does allow him and Magneto to be selected via a dip switch menu that you input a code to access. The company that ported the PS1 version, Probe Software, also did the DOTS port that released in the same time frame, and as such, retains this dip switch menu that allows him to be selected. With the release of the Marvel vs. Capcom Fighting Collection though, he and Magneto are finally enabled for regular use in the arcade ROM after 30 years. It should be noted that no matter what version of the game you play, he doesn't have an ending. In the Saturn version, if you use cheats to select him, beating Magneto shows Akuma's short ending before zipping straight to the game over screen. On PS1, DOS, and the Fighting Collection, you go straight to the credits after Magneto. Also, should be noted that Juggernaut doesn't fight himself in arcade mode. A standard fight gets put in his place instead, regardless of platform. Once you finally get the opportunity to control Juggernaut, you can see why he seems so forbidden. This man's damage is predictably insane. He also gets a bunch of armor on a lot of his attacks, and he's pretty much always a simple combo away from stunning you. We're talking in the ballpark of a 3 or 4 hit combo. And his normals do chip damage, which is actually a lot more helpful than you'd think. That said, he's a really big target. For as destructive as head crush is, it's extraordinarily slow, and most of his normals have tremendous recovery. All you have to do is take one look at Juggernaut to know he hits hard, and yeah, he does. Juggernaut has a command normal, Body Press, done by pressing down and heavy punch in the air. Juggernaut's first move is Juggernaut Punch, done with a quarter circle forward and punch. If this looks different from the Juggernaut Punch you may have remembered from the series, it's probably because this version in particular actually becomes a command normal later on in the series. It's slow, but it hits pretty hard and has decent reach. Next is Earthquake Punch, done with a quarter circle down and punch. Juggernaut punches the ground with both fists and creates a shockwave whose distance depends on the strength of the punch button pressed. This hits low, so do make sure you're crouch blocking properly against this. Pressing down, and either medium or heavy punch near a downed opponent gives you overhead lift. Like Sentinel and Colossus, Juggernaut can walk around with a knockdown opponent, and pressing a punch button will have him attack the opponent, ending the capture state. Pressing down, and any punch next to a steel beam will allow Juggernaut to grab it, making his grounded punch normals even slower but more powerful, and with a hell of a lot more range. This can only be done on Juggernaut stage, however. Curiously, in prior console ports, even the ones he's not supposed to be playable in like the Saturn version, Juggernaut's coded to always have the steel beams appear regardless of the stage, which is interesting. This was the case even if you emulated the arcade version and used cheats to play as him that way, so it appears to be a deliberate omission for the collection, probably for balance reasons. Juggernaut's X-Power in this game is Sidorak Power-Up. Juggernaut poses and begins glowing red for a short period of time. During this period, all of Juggernaut's attacks do more damage, making even stray hits risky for opponents to take. A half circle forward and punch gives you Juggernaut Head Crush. This move won't really change too much going forward, but it's worth noting how horrific this move startup is. It's best used to punctuate stun combos. In prior versions of the game, since Juggernaut technically isn't supposed to be playable and mirror matches with him aren't even supposed to exist, he doesn't have unique player 2 colors. If you emulate the arcade version and use emulator cheats to force a Juggernaut mirror match, the player 2 color will be slightly darker, but still essentially the same. In the PS1 and Saturn versions, player 2 Juggernaut is literally identical. Good luck figuring that out during a fight. The Marvel vs. Capcom Fighting Collection, now that it makes him freely available, actually backports his player 2 color from Marvel superheroes so that he has a proper distinctive color scheme now. Juggernaut's stage is Spaceport. As the name suggests, this is a port that has the Blackbird docked in the background being prepped for launch into space to confront Magneto and Avalon. There's all kinds of valves and piping on the right side of the stage, which I imagine is kind of necessary architecture for a place like this. The most notable part of the stage, aside from the aforementioned beams that Juggernaut can use, is that the stage can be visibly damaged. During the fight, large hits will cause chunks of debris to fall, as well as dent some of the larger steel support beams in the background. In some cases, the Blackbird will even fall out of its docking position, which doesn't seem like a good situation for the X-Men. The X-Men have had all sorts of space adventures before, so something like this isn't out of the ordinary, though focusing on the actual launch base of the ship does call to mind issue 99 of Uncanny X-Men, where they go up to space to save the other X-Men captured by Sentinels. This stage's theme is composed by Takayuki Iwai. He was one of the main composers of the Darkstalkers games, as well as Cyberbots and most relevantly Armored Warriors, which this track sounds like it could be ripped right out of. Armored Warriors released 2 months before Children of the Atom, so it's not out of the realm of possibility that both songs were composed within close proximity of each other. Juggernaut returns in Marvel Superheroes as a regular base roster character, being mercifully nerfed from his boss appearance in Children of the Atom. Juggernaut is voiced in this game and every subsequent Capcom game by Rick Bennett, his voice actor from X-Men the Animated Series. I'm going to assume they had more time to plan things out this time around. Juggernaut's been understandably toned down from his appearance as a boss character in the previous game, but how does he fare overall? He still hits like several freight trains at once, he retains a decent amount of armor on a lot of his attacks, and Head Crush is a lot faster now, making it a viable and painful whiff punish tool if you have the meter. He's still really slow overall though. The recovery on most of his attacks still leaves him pretty open to punishes, and his size makes a lot of the game's infinites easier than usual to perform on him. I actually want to talk a bit about Juggernaut's size here. He's the same size as in Children of the Atom, but how it affects the earlier console ports is worth noting. I imagine most people watching this series knows that the console ports of most Versus games tended to be compromised in some way due to hardware limitations. There were a few exceptions, sure, like the 4MB RAM boosted Saturn ports of X-Men and Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter. But Children of the Atom and Marvel Superheroes weren't so lucky. A common cutback made in these console ports related to big characters. Characters with bigger sprites of course took up more memory, so they tended to have the most harsh animation cuts all around. This is most noticeable with Juggernaut in the PS1 and Saturn ports of Marvel Superheroes, where he's a few steps away from being a slideshow. He doesn't even have a crouch animation. The Saturn version in particular does support the 1MB RAM cart, which does partially restore animations, though they're still not arcade quality. The problem is that this animation boost comes with somewhat disruptive slowdown. This gets worse when bigger characters like Juggernaut are involved, and even more so on stages where there's a lot going on, like Blackheart stage. Later releases like Marvel vs. Capcom Origins and the Fighting Collection evade this by emulating the arcade game instead. Juggernaut has a new command normal in this game, Double Punch, done with forward and heavy punch. And yes, your eyes aren't deceiving you, that's his old Juggernaut punch animation from Children of the Atom. A notable property of this version of the move is that it can also function as a launcher to lead into air combos with. His first special move is a new retooled version of Juggernaut Punch, done with a half circle forward and punch.
Juggernaut punch!
Juggernaut dashes forward a bit before throwing a massive downwards punch, making a crater where his fist lands. This is the most well-known incarnation of the move and would persist in further Versus games. Juggernaut's body press command normal from Children of the Atom now becomes a full-fledged special move from Marvel Superheroes onwards, done with a half circle and kick in the air. He notably now does a little hop when initiating this move, altering his jump trajectory somewhat. This has even more recovery than in Children of the Atom though, so just be aware. While Juggernaut loses the ability to lift opponents up in Marvel Superheroes, he can still interact with the stage using Super Lift. On certain stages, there are foreground objects that can be lifted up and thrown at the opponent, and the objects differ depending on the stage. Sidorak power-up is now done with a Dragon Punch motion in 2 punches.
Power up!
It's been rebalanced from Children of the Atom in that it's no longer tied to meter, but now only affects the first hit after activating it. This is how the move would function in every subsequent game, at least for the most part. We'll talk about the exception in a bit. Juggernaut Head Crush is now done with a quarter circle forward in 2 punches. It's much faster and can actually be feasibly comboed into now, making it great for dealing devastating damage without a stun combo or a hard read like in the previous game. Juggernaut's preferred gem power in Marvel Superheroes is the Space Gem. This gives Juggernaut Hyper Armor, making him essentially impervious to damage and hit stun while this move is active. It should be noted that one of Juggernaut's powers in the comics includes a passive force field that surrounds and protects him from harm at all times. This probably informs his super and hyper armor in these games. Juggernaut's stage is in the Dockyard during the daytime. Funny how he gets out of the industrial looking stages. In the middle of the stage seems to be some workers cheering on the fight. Shoutouts to the guy on the left that's either injured or just sleeping on the job. You can see crates in the background being transported via pulley above the fight from the right side of the screen all the way to the left. Over to the far left, there seems to be some numbered canisters. No idea what's in them, but considering how secure the canisters seem to be, I'd have to imagine there's some kind of hazardous materials in there. In the second farthest background layer, there appears to be a massive ship in the background offloading its cargo. It's labeled United Line, and more than likely a pastiche of the real-life Denver-based United Shipping Line. Capcom would do something similar in Capcom vs. SNK 1, featuring a train labeled Orion Pacific, likely meant to be a legal-friendly nod to the real-life Union Pacific Railway. His theme in Marvel Superheroes is once again composed by Takayuki Iwai, who also did Spider-Man, Blackheart, Doctor Doom, Iron Man, and Captain America's themes. It's not a remix of Juggernaut's Children of the Atom theme, but sounds very much in line with it. the first half of the song being done in mostly the same key. A friend of mine years ago once told me that this theme specifically sounds like a cheesy stripper entrance song, and I've never been able to unhear it since. Here are Juggernaut's colors. And here's Juggernaut's ending. Juggernaut keeps up his perfect attendance streak in X-Men vs. Street Fighter, being one of 3 playable X-Men villains in the arcade version alongside Sabretooth and Magneto. So, what's new for Juggernaut in X-Men vs. Street Fighter? Surprisingly, not much. Pretty much all of the pros and cons that applied to Juggernaut in the previous game apply to him here as well. Rogue in particular is a pretty awful matchup for him. Her dive kick infinite against taller characters is incredibly easy to perform on him, and she has another infinite she can do after stealing his Earthquake Punch ability that's also relatively easy to do. Juggernaut's theme in this game is composed by Yuki Iwai, who also did Magneto, Rogue, and Gambit's theme. This theme is decidedly more upbeat than his last 2, but not in a bad way. It doesn't sound vaguely threatening like the previous themes, but the tempo calls to mind something running out of control, which fits an unstoppable force like Juggernaut to the T. Juggernaut's moveset is pretty much the same this time around, though he does lose his Super Lift move. However, he gets one new move this time around, Nail Slam, done with a half circle back and any kick button. Juggernaut grabs the opponent and slams them into the ground a few times before knocking them away. It looks cool, but its range is pretty bad. Here are Juggernaut's colors in the arcade version. And here are his exclusive colors in the Sega Saturn version. And here's Juggernaut's ending. Juggernaut's mentioning of a time he beat the Hulk is most likely referencing the Incredible Hulk issue 402, one of the few times Juggernaut's actually gotten a win on Hulk, though admittedly, this was against Professor Hulk, one of the comparatively weaker incarnations of the character. So, I hear y'all like comic recommendations. I'm not going to pretend Juggernaut is the deepest X-Men character out there, and a lot of his early appearances have him essentially as muscle working for other people. But there's some stories out there that give him some much welcome layers. And in all fairness, even those earlier stories are really great, even just for the spectacle of Juggernaut doing Juggernaut things. First off, I'd actually recommend his debut in issues 12 and 13 of the original Stan Lee and Jack Kirby run. Early X-Men can be hit or miss, but a lot of the issues that debut long-standing characters tend to hold up pretty okay, and Juggernaut's debut is no different. Issues 183 and 217 of Uncanny X-Men during Chris Claremont's run have some pretty good showcases of Juggernaut going up against Colossus in a bar fight, and Dazzler respectively. Chuck Austin's written what's generally considered to be one of, if not the worst X-Men run of all time, but most people, myself included, generally agree that Juggernaut is probably the best part of the run. thanks to an unlikely friendship he strikes up with a fish mutant named Sammy. I'm not saying to seek out that run, but if you do, there's that. It's honestly kind of touching, and kinda what started Juggernaut down the path of redemption he's on now. He's in Jed McKay's current X-Men run as a part of Cyclops' X-Men team, and honestly, it's just great to see the big guy thriving. I had my reservations about the book, but it's really grown on me. When you think Juggernaut though, you're probably thinking of him throwing down with other characters, which makes sense, so I think my recommendation should follow suit. With that in mind, I do have a recommendation that shows how scary Juggernaut can be when the person on the other end absolutely isn't in his weight class and has to rely on their wits to survive. It's gonna sound weird because this isn't an X-Men story, but instead another big-time Marvel Heroes book, but most people agree that it's one of the best stories to ever feature Juggernaut. Some comic book fans probably already know where I'm going with this. It's a brisk 2-issue read that doesn't require you to know anything but the absolute bare minimum about the characters involved, and is one hell of a roller coaster from start to finish. This video's comic book recommendation is Nothing Can Stop the Juggernaut by Roger Stern and John Romita Jr., comprised of issues 229 and 230 of The Amazing Spider-Man. The tale begins with Madam Web having a nightmare. A large being cloaked in darkness is out for her life, and the champion of hers tries his best to fend him off and defend her, only to fall like the rest. Madam Web wakes up and realizes it's not just a dream, but a vision of the future, and she calls the one man she believes can save her, Spider-Man. On the other end of things, Black Tom Cassidy and Juggernaut are trying to think of ways to get a leg up over the X-Men, and Cassidy comes up with the idea of kidnapping Madam Web and using her precognitive powers to help them defeat the X-Men. To that end, he tasks Juggernaut with finding and capturing her, to which Juggernaut agrees. Madam Web didn't give Spidey too much to go off of other than the fact that they'd emerged from the water near Battery Park, so he heads downtown to find Juggernaut striding with purpose towards Madam Web's location. What ensues is 2 issues of Spider-Man using every single trick in the book to stop or even slow down Juggernaut, to no avail. Direct attacks don't work, webbing won't work, and none of Spidey's tricks seem to be slowing him down one bit. This is definitely a story about Spidey's perseverance and his ability to never give up, even when the chips are down. But on the other end is Juggernaut being this literally unstoppable force that's several weight classes above Spidey, forcing some unconventional approaches. It's as much a heroic Spidey story as it is a holy shit, Juggernaut is really him story. Part of what makes this story so great is Spidey's desperation and his exasperation at Juggernaut tanking things that would destroy anyone else. There's even a bit where he's concerned he might have actually killed him, only for Jugs to walk through the flames completely unscathed. Baller as hell. And I'd be absolutely remiss if I didn't highlight John Romita Jr. doing what might be some of the best art he's ever done at Marvel for this story. From Spidey's acrobatics, Juggernaut being completely unbothered by everything being thrown at him, to Black Tom Cassidy watching everything unfold with binoculars, there isn't a single wasted panel. I can't help but feel like this story was probably the inspiration behind the Juggernaut boss fight in Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions. The arena is even a nod to their final confrontation in issue 230. This story actually got a sequel decades later, also written by Stern in issues 627 through 629 of The Amazing Spider-Man, appropriately titled Something Can Stop the Juggernaut. This one's definitely more of a Spidey story this time around, but Juggernaut is a big factor into it, and it's informed by the events of the original story if you'd like to read it. Juggernaut sits out Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, but did appear as an assist in Marvel vs. Capcom. He's actually one of the best assists in the game, though he's balanced out by only getting 3 uses in any given match. Gambit in particular has a mid-screen touch of death combo that utilizes Juggernaut, seen in this video from AC Slayer. I'll link it in the description. To ensure Juggernaut selection, hold light punch, medium kick, and start during assist selection. Juggernaut makes his playable return to the series in Marvel vs. Capcom 2, and has at least one major thing worth talking about here. Marvel vs. Capcom 2 is arguably Juggernaut's most interesting incarnation from a competitive standpoint for a few reasons. The Juggernaut glitch easily boosts him from a non-issue to an explosive character when stocked with meter. He's not a combo-heavy character. Can you link standing heavy punch into head crush? Congrats, you've just learned his best hit confirm in the super. Head crush in general is just an outstanding punish tool this time around. But as I mentioned earlier though, even with the glitch, you're gonna need Mita to actually utilize those devastating head crushes. He has the same problem most other big bodies have, and that they make for bigger targets. And while the glitch is pretty much necessary to make him work well, it can also be incredibly obvious when you're setting it up, and there's counterplay for it. It's worth noting that Juggernaut actually loses his command grab from X-Men vs Street Fighter. I do wonder how it would have looked against taller characters like Sentinel or Blackheart. Before we talk about the glitch, I do want to talk about Juggernaut head crush a bit. Because punishing assist calls are a valuable way to whittle down an opposing team, Juggernaut's head crush being relatively fast, damaging, and getting him across the screen quickly makes it one of the best punish tools in the game against assists and point characters alike. Juggernaut's head crush usually only hits about 4 times, but can actually be mashed for up to 8 hits. There's a bit of science behind it though. It's range and in some cases, height specific. It's most reliably done if using a B&B combo to push the opponent away a bit, or via a DHC, which will put Juggernaut in the optimal range for mashing all 8 hits. Of course though, you can't talk about Juggernaut without talking about the Juggernaut Glitch. This glitch boosts Juggernaut's damage to insane levels, and is what elevates him from an honestly kinda not great character competitively to actually being viable, albeit a little gimmicky. It's actually an incredibly simple glitch to pull off too. Simply use Juggernaut's Sidorak power up, and while the buff is active, tag out to one of your partners. After that, tag Juggernaut back in, and that's it, you're done. While Juggernaut won't be flashing red, he'll still have the buff. Only this time, it'll remain permanent for as long as you have him tagged in. Usually, the buff disappears after a single action or hit, but because it's permanent, it makes Juggernaut head crush in particular almost comical in how much damage it'll do since all 4 to 8 hits will be boosted now. There's a common misconception online that this glitch in particular wasn't in the 360 and PS3 HD ports of the game. But not only is that not true, it's actually one of the only glitches in Marvel 2 that's remained available in every release. It's in the original Dreamcast version. It's in the PS2 and Xbox ports. And it's in the 360 and PS3 version. It was actually missing from the Marvel vs. Capcom Fighting Collection at launch, but just days after release, a patch was issued that not only reinstated the glitch, but actually made it an officially toggleable feature via the game's EX menu. It seems like Capcom themselves agree with the general consensus that this glitch is essential to its viability, since it's actually turned on by default and is always enabled in online play. The way it was explained to me by folks who poked into the mess of coding that makes up Marvel 2, it not being available was more than likely unintended on Capcom's part and might have actually happened as a consequence of fixing another, more disruptive glitch, namely the Gambit glitch. Essentially, the main thing that ties both glitches together is that they both involve the game's calls to memory addresses during a match and switches things out on the fly. Part of the Gambit glitch involves whiffing a snapback, which means that even though it doesn't connect, the game briefly preps data needed to bring in the snapback character's teammate. By fixing whatever memory error caused the Gambit glitch to happen, it likely unintentionally fixed the Juggernaut glitch as well, since it's relying on tagging out, and it's digging into the same bits of memory the Gambit glitch does. It's not the first or likely the last time a glitch in a Capcom fighting game's become an official feature, but it's always cool to see when it happens. And as I'm finishing up editing this video, Capcom announced the release date for Capcom Fighting Collection 2 with a new trailer, and lo and behold, a glitch in the Japanese version of Project Justice, somewhat known among players, is toggleable in the same way the Juggernaut glitch was. Like I said, probably not the last time this will ever happen. Juggernaut's first assist is Earthquake Punch.
I'm Juggernaut.
His second assist is Juggernaut Punch.
Juggernaut Punch! I'm Juggernaut! Juggernaut Punch! I'm Juggernaut!
His third assist is Juggernaut Body Press.
I'm Juggernaut! I'm Juggernaut!
And here are his colors. It's worth noting that his third and fourth colors are pretty close to his Saturn exclusive colors in X-Men vs. Street Fighter, making him one of the few characters in the series to actually get their console exclusive colors from a previous game in an arcade sequel. Juggernaut's one of those characters that really displays how larger than life the series is, both figuratively and literally. He's been a memorable mid-boss, he has an all-timer sprite, a unique competitive niche in the most popular Capcom vs. game, and is just a joy to press buttons with at all levels of play. Juggernaut being so recognizable is probably why he shows up in so much stuff. As mentioned earlier, he's a boss in Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions, he was a boss in X-Men Legends, became playable in X-Men Legends 2, and was a DLC character in Ultimate Alliance 2. Juggernaut's also been playable in other fighting games too, most notably X-Men Mutant Academy 2 and its sequel X-Men Next Dimension. If you want to learn more about the latter, I highly recommend looking up Sandalwood Grip's channel, as he has a ton of incredibly detailed videos explaining and showcasing how the game works on a character-by-character basis. That said, that's going to do it for this video. As always, thanks for watching, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.